Metheglin was a drink. It was an alcoholic drink popular in medieval times, especially in places like Wales and England. At its heart, it was a type of mead. And mead is simple. Mead is honey wine. You take honey, you add water, and you let it ferment. Yeast, either added or from the wild, eats the sugar and the honey. It turns that sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The result is mead. But metheglin was different. It was mead with a twist. The twist was the addition of spices and herbs. This is the single most important thing to know about it. If mead was just honey and water, metheglin was honey, water, and a whole garden of flavors. This made it more complex, it made it more interesting, and in the eyes of medieval people, it often made it more valuable. The name itself tells you a lot. The word metheglin comes from Welsh. It comes from the word metheglin. If you break that down, medij means doctor or healing, and lin means liquor or drink. So, right there in the name, you have its story. It was a healing liquor, a medicinal drink. This connection to medicine was not just a name, it was central to how people thought about metheglin. They believed the herbs and spices infused into the honey wine could cure sickness, improve digestion, or just generally make you feel better. It was a tonic as much as it was a treat. You can think of it like this. Ale was the everyday drink for most people. It was the water of the Middle Ages, safer to drink than many water sources. Wine, made from grapes, was often for the rich or for special occasions, especially in places where grapes didn't grow well, like England. Mead was somewhere in that world, a traditional drink made from a precious resource, honey. Metheglin was a step above that. It was special mead, it was flavored mead. The line between mead and metheglin could be blurry. Any mead with flavorings could technically be called something else. If you added fruit, it might be called a melomel. If you added apple juice, it was a cider. But metheglin was specifically about the herbs and spices. Think of things like ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, rosemary, thyme, or marjoram. These ingredients transform the simple, sweet taste of mead into something else entirely. It could be spicy, bitter, aromatic, or savory. The possibilities were endless, limited only by the brewer's imagination and their access to ingredients. This access was key. While some herbs like rosemary or thyme could be grown in a local garden, many of the most desirable spices had to travel a long way. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper came from the east. They were incredibly expensive. This meant that a metheglin made with these exotic spices was not a drink for a poor farmer. It was a drink for a lord, a wealthy merchant, or a high-ranking cleric. It was a status symbol. Serving a rich, complex metheglin at your table showed your guests that you were wealthy and had connections. You could afford the honey, and you could afford the rare spices to flavor it. So, metheglin was not one single thing. There was no one recipe, it was a category of drink. Each batch would have been different. It depended on the type of honey used. It depended on the season. It depended on the specific blend of herbs and spices the maker chose. Some might have been light and floral, flavored with elderflower and lemon balm. Others could have been dark and warming, heavy, with ginger and cloves, perfect for a cold winter night. This variety is part of what makes it so fascinating. It was a canvas for the flavors of the medieval world. It was a drink that was both a beverage and a medicine, a pleasure and a prescription. It captured the taste of the time, a blend of local sweetness from the beehive and exotic scents from faraway lands. To understand metheglin, you have to understand its parts. The foundation was always honey. But medieval honey was not like the uniform clear liquid you buy in a plastic bear at the supermarket. Honey was a direct product of its environment. Its flavor, color, and thickness all depended on what flowers the bees visited. Beekeeping was a serious business. It was called apiculture. Many monasteries and large manors kept their own hives, called skeps, which were often woven from straw. Honey was the main source of sweetness for centuries. Sugar from sugarcane was a rare and costly import until much later. So honey was used in everything, from preserving food to making sweets to brewing drinks. The honey harvest was a major event. The type of honey made a huge difference. Honey from bees that fed on clover would be light and mild. Heather honey, common in parts of Britain, was much darker with a strong, almost smoky flavor. Honey from wildflowers would be complex and unpredictable. The brewer of metheglin had to work with what they had. A strong honey like heather might need strong spices to balance it. A lighter honey might be better with delicate herbs. The honey also contained wild yeasts on its own, which could sometimes be enough to start fermentation without adding anything else. Water was the next ingredient. Just like with honey, the water source mattered. People didn't have access to purified, filtered water. They used water from a well, a spring, or a river. This water had its own mineral content and its own microorganisms. This would add another layer of regional character to the final drink. Some water might make a better brew than others. A brewer would know the best local source for their work. Then came the heart of Metheglin, the spices and herbs. This is what separated it from simple mead. The range of possible additions was huge. We can break them down into two main groups, local and imported. Local herbs were the easiest to get. They could be grown in a kitchen garden or foraged from the wild. These were the flavors of the European countryside. Rosemary was very popular. It has a strong pine-like aroma and was believed to be good for the memory. Thyme was another common choice, with its earthy, slightly minty flavor. Sage, marjoram, and lemon balm were also used. Flowers were sometimes added too. Elderflower would give a delicate floral scent. The lavender or rose petals could be used for both flavor and aroma. These local herbs were the basis for many household metheglins. They were affordable and familiar. They were also deeply connected to folk medicine. Every village had people who knew the properties of local plants, and these would be chosen for their perceived health benefits as much as their taste. The other group of flavorings was the imported spices. These were the ingredients that made metheglin a luxury. They came from Asia and the Middle East, traveling thousands of miles along dangerous trade routes like the Silk Road. They passed through many hands, getting more expensive at every step. By the time they reached a market in London or Paris, they were worth a fortune. Ginger was a favorite. It provided a pungent heat and a spicy aroma. It was thought to be good for the stomach and to warm the body. Cinnamon and its cheaper cousin, cassia, were also highly prized. They gave a sweet, woody warmth to the drink. Cloves were incredibly potent. Just a few could dominate a brew with their intense medicinal flavor. They were used to treat toothaches and were considered a powerful spice. Nutmeg and mace, which come from the same plant, offered a sweet, aromatic quality. Grains of paradise, a spice from West Africa, had a peppery bite and were sometimes used as a cheaper alternative to black pepper. Choosing the blend of these herbs and spices was an art. The brewer was like a chef creating a recipe. They might use a combination of local and imported ingredients. A recipe, or reet, as it was called, might call for a bit of rosemary for sharpness, some cloves for depth, and a touch of cinnamon for warmth. These ingredients were not always used fresh. They were often dried, which concentrated their flavors. They would be bruised or ground up to help release their oils into the fermenting mead. The combination of these building blocks, the local honey, the regional water, and a unique mix of herbs and spices, meant that no two metheglins were ever truly the same. Each barrel was an experiment, a liquid snapshot of its time and place. Making metheglin in the medieval period was not a precise science. It was a craft, a skill passed down through generations. There were no thermometers, no hydrometers to measure sugar content, and no sterilized equipment. It was a process guided by experience, sight, smell, and a bit of luck. It all started with the honey and water. The first step was to create the must, which is the name for the unfermented liquid that will become mead. The brewer would mix honey with water in a large pot or cauldron. The ratio of honey to water was crucial. More honey meant more sugar, which would lead to a stronger, sweeter drink. Less honey would produce a lighter, drier mead. Recipes from the time show a wide range of ratios, from 1 part honey to 3 parts water, all the way up to equal parts honey and water for a very rich brew. Often this mixture would be heated. Heating served a few purposes. It helped the honey dissolve completely into the water. It also helped to skim off impurities. As the honey heated, a waxy scum would rise to the surface, which the brewer would scoop away. This created a cleaner base for the drink. Some argue that boiling the must also helped to kill off some of the wild bacteria and yeast, giving the brewer a little more control over the fermentation. However, boiling also drives off some of the delicate aromas of the honey, so some brewers may have preferred a no-heat method, simply mixing the honey and water thoroughly without fire. This is when the herbs and spices were added. There were a few ways to do this. Some brewers would add the spices directly to the must while it was heating. They might put the whole spices, cinnamon sticks, whole cloves, sprigs of rosemary into a cloth bag like a giant tea bag. This allowed the flavors to infuse into the liquid without leaving a lot of debris behind that would need to be filtered out later. The longer the spices were left in, the stronger their flavor would be. This was a matter of judgment. The brewer had to know when to pull them out. Another method was to add the spices during fermentation or even after it was finished. This was like a secondary flavoring. It could result in a fresher, more direct flavor from the herbs, as they wouldn't have been cooked. Once the must was prepared and flavored, it was time for fermentation. The must was cooled and transferred into a fermentation vessel. This was usually a wooden barrel, but large clay pots were also used. Wood was common, but it's hard to clean. The nooks and crannies of an old barrel would be home to its own community of wild yeasts and bacteria. It could give a specific brewery's products a unique and consistent, if not always predictable, character. Yeast was the magic ingredient. Sometimes enough wild yeast was present in the honey in the water or in the wooden barrel itself to kick off fermentation spontaneously. But this was risky. It could lead to a slow start or the growth of unwanted organisms that could spoil the batch. A more reliable method was to use yeast from a previous batch of brewing. Brewers would often scoop the frothy yeast head barm from a fermenting batch of ale and add it to their metheglin must. Ale yeast was readily available and worked well. This cross-pollination between brewing beer and making mead was common. Fermentation would begin. The liquid would start to bubble as the yeast consumed the sugar and produced alcohol. This primary fermentation could be vigorous, lasting for a week or several weeks, depending on the temperature and the strength of the must. In the medieval world, there was no temperature control. The brewer worked with the seasons. A brew started in the autumn would ferment slowly and coolly through the winter. A summer brew would ferment much faster and might have a different flavor profile. After the initial rapid fermentation slowed down, the metheglin would be left to age. It might be racked, which means siphoned off the thick layer of dead yeast and sediment at the bottom of the barrel into a clean one. This helped to clarify the drink and prevent all flavors from developing. Aging was critical. A young metheglin could be harsh and raw. It needed time for the flavors to meld and mellow. This could take months or even years for a very strong batch. The metheglin would be stored in a cool, dark cellar in its wooden barrel. Over time, the sharp edges of the alcohol would soften, and the complex flavors of the honey and spices would come together in harmony. The final product was a drink that was truly handmade, a testament to the skill and patience of its creator. Metheglin was woven into the fabric of medieval life. It wasn't just something people drank to quench their thirst or get drunk. It held a real meaning. Its roles were varied, touching on medicine, social status, and celebration. Its most defining role was as a form of medicine. As its Welsh name Metheglin suggests, it was seen as a healing liquor. This belief was rooted in the medical theories of the time, particularly the idea of the four humors. This theory held that the body was composed of four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sickness was caused by an imbalance of these humors. Foods and drinks were classified as hot, cold, wet, or dry, and they could be used to correct these imbalances. Honey itself was considered a healthy food, but it was the herbs and spices in metheglin that really gave it its medicinal reputation. Each ingredient was thought to have specific properties. Ginger and cloves were hot and dry spices. A metheglin made with them would be prescribed to someone suffering from a cold and wet ailment, like a cold or a chesty cough. It was believed to warm the body, aid digestion, and clear the lungs. Rosemary was thought to sharpen the mind. Sage was used for sore throats. A brewer could create specific metheglins to treat specific problems. These weren't just vague folk remedies, they were part of the accepted medical knowledge of the era. Doctors and apothecaries would prescribe certain spiced wines and meads as part of a treatment plan. Drinking metheglin wasn't just indulgence, it could be seen as a way of maintaining your health. Beyond medicine, metheglin was a powerful symbol of wealth and status. The key was the cost of its ingredients. Honey was valuable, but the imported spices were true luxuries. A pound of nutmeg in the 14th century could cost as much as a cow. Pepper, cloves, and cinnamon were not far behind. Only the rich could afford to use these precious commodities to flavor a drink. For a nobleman or a wealthy merchant, serving metheglin at a feast was a clear display of power. It told your guests several things. First, that you had the money to buy the ingredients. Second, that you had access to the trade networks that brought these spices from the other side of the world. And third, that you had a skilled household staff capable of producing such a fine beverage. The complexity of the flavor profile mattered. A metheglin with a simple one-note flavor of a local herb was one thing. A metheglin with a sophisticated blend of half a dozen exotic spices was something else entirely. It was the medieval equivalent of serving a rare, expensive vintage wine. Poems and stories from the period often describe great halls where lords and their warriors drink spiced mead from horns or silver cups. It was part of the image of a successful and generous leader. This made it a drink of celebration. While a farmer might celebrate the harvest with a barrel of ale, a king might celebrate a victory in battle or a royal wedding with casks of the finest metheglin. It was special. It was reserved for important moments. The sweetness of the honey and the warmth of the spices made it feel festive and luxurious. It was stronger than ale, so it was also more potent. It was a drink meant for feasting and making merry. Of course, this doesn't mean it was completely unknown to common people. Simpler versions, made with garden herbs instead of imported spices, would have been made in smaller households. A farmer might make a small batch flavored with thyme or mint from their own garden. This would still have been a treat, perhaps saved for a holiday like Christmas or Easter. But the grand, spice-laden metheglins of legend and literature were firmly the domain of the upper classes. It existed on a spectrum, from a simple homemade herbal remedy to a dazzling display of international wealth. This versatility is what allowed it to find a place in so many different corners of medieval society. It could be in a doctor's bag on a peasant's holiday table, or in the king's golden chalice. For centuries, metheglin was a significant drink in many parts of Europe, but its golden age did not last forever. Over time, a series of changes in agriculture, trade, and taste slowly pushed it from the center of the table to the margins of history. Its decline was not a single event, but a slow fading caused by the rise of other beverages. One of the biggest challengers was hopped beer. For much of the Middle Ages, the common drink was ale, which was made from malted barley, water, and yeast. It didn't keep well. It had to be drunk fresh, within a few days of being made. But starting around the 11th century in Germany and spreading across Europe over the next few hundred years, brewers began adding hops to their brew. Hops acted as a preservative, allowing beer to be stored and transported over longer distances. The hops also provided a bitter flavor that balanced the sweetness of the malt. This new hopped beer was more stable, more consistent, and cheaper to produce in large quantities than metheglin. As cities grew, commercial breweries began to produce beer on a large scale, making it the dominant drink of the masses. At the other end of the social scale, metheglin faced competition from grape wine. In England and other northern European countries, wine had always been a high-status import, mainly from France. As trade routes became more established and political ties shifted, wine became more available and, for the wealthy, more fashionable. The culture of wine, with its vineyards, vintages, and regional varieties, began to overshadow the older traditions of mead making. For the elite, French claret became the new status symbol to serve at feasts. Another major blow came from the world of sugar. For most of history, honey was the primary sweetener, but the age of exploration and the rise of colonial empires brought a new source of sweetness to Europe, refined sugar from sugarcane plantations in the New World. While it started as a luxury, the scale of production, often reliant on slave labor, eventually made sugar cheaper and more plentiful than honey. This had a huge impact. Honey lost its unique position. With sugar readily available, brewers could make sweetened drinks more easily, and the economic foundation of beekeeping and mead production was weakened. Finally, the advent of distilled spirits created yet another competitor. Brandy, whiskey, and gin offered a much higher alcohol content in a smaller volume. These potent new drinks found their own place in the market, appealing to those seeking a stronger effect. So metheglin was squeezed from all sides. Beer took over the low end of the market, wine and spirits took over the high end, and sugar replaced its key ingredient as the main sweetener. The old medicinal beliefs associated with it also faded with the rise of modern science. The idea of using spice mead to balance your humors seemed quaint and outdated. The metheglin never disappeared completely. It survived in pockets, especially in places with strong mead-making traditions like Wales. It became a folk drink, a historical curiosity made by a few families or enthusiasts who kept the old recipes alive. It was a drink of the past, but in recent decades, something interesting has happened. There has been a revival. A new generation of brewers and drinkers has rediscovered this ancient beverage. This revival is part of a larger movement towards craft products, local ingredients, and historical authenticity. People are interested in how things used to be made. They are looking for flavors that are different from the mass-produced drinks that dominate the market. Craft meaderies have been popping up around the world. They are not just making simple mead, they are experimenting with a full range of historical styles, including metheglin. They are using high-quality local honey and carefully sourced spices to recreate the drinks of the past. Homebrewers are also a huge part of this revival. They share old recipes online, trade tips on techniques, and experiment with their own unique spice blends. Today's metheglin is both old and new. Brewers might use modern sterile equipment and specific yeast strains for a clean, predictable fermentation that a medieval brewer could only dream of. But the spirit of the drink is the same. It is about the creative combination of honey, herbs, and spices. It is about creating a complex, flavorful drink that tells a story. The story of medieval metheglin is not just about a forgotten beverage. And it's about the connection between food and medicine, the flow of global trade, the importance of social status, and the way our tastes change over time. And it's a story that, after a long, quiet sleep, is being told once again.